Hello, and thank you for joining me for this short video on strategic 360 feedback. I'll be talking today about 360 feedback in perhaps a little different way than it's often been thought of. Often 360 feedback is considered kind of an individual level leader feedback mechanism, but we're going to talk about how to make it much more strategic and how that shows up. My name's Dale Rose. I'm the president of 3D Group, and we've been doing this work for over 20 years, so I'm excited to share with you some of the work and some of the thought leadership we have around 360 feedback, as well as a case study in which I'll show you some of the work that we've done in kind of leveling things up from individual level to really group level and strategic level 360-degree feedback. So in part one, I'm going to talk a little bit and share some of our thought leadership around best practices in 360 and really how you can focus on changing behavior and understanding the levers within a 360 feedback that will produce behavior change versus inhibit behavior change. Many organizations do 360s, but don't always think about the different components of their process that might help leaders to change or perhaps even inhibit their change. And so being thoughtful about your design is going to make a huge difference. Hopefully this video will give you some perspectives on how to do that and how to do it well. And one of the first things to look at, and particularly in the recent years, there's been a big outgrowth of 360 feedback in a bunch of different areas. And so there's also been kind of a lack of clarity around what 360 is. You see all kinds of forms show up that are claiming to be 360 this, 360 that. So some colleagues of mine and I wrote on this and really felt that defining 360 feedback was a really important place to start. So thinking about 360s as a process, first of all, for quantifying and reporting coworker observations. Very important that we include these elements in thinking about it as quantified. It's about coworkers, and it's about observations of an individual. It's, but importantly, very focused on change. So understanding what we can do to encourage change becomes incredibly important. Now, when we start to unpack what those kind of critical elements are that differentiate 360 from some other assessment methods, one of the things we recognize is that 360 feedback is about rater perceptions. Right? You're asking individuals, coworkers, what their observations and perceptions are of the individual. And as we know, of course, those perceptions vary from individual to individual. But it's also perceptions about their behaviors. So it's not, is this person a good person, a bad person, this personality or that personality, but rather how are they actually behaving? And how are they behaving on not just any old behaviors, but importantly, behaviors valued by the organization. So 360 becomes a very useful way for an organization to communicate what behaviors they value, and then give leaders guidance as to what they can be doing to exhibit those behaviors and help move the organization's strategy and implementation forward. Now, the other thing that's really critical in a 360 process is you need to be able to create meaningful comparisons. You've got to be able to look at differences between rater groups. Typical rater groups might be direct reports, peers, boss, and then even yourself. And really, one of the key values in 360 is to understand, well, how do my peers see me versus how do my direct reports see me, and why might those be different? We're not assuming that everyone will see you the same, so understanding those differences become really important. Now, understanding differences is nice, but again, as we talked about, it's really about change. And so we have a model where we think about, what are the key components for creating change. When you think about what will it take to actually get someone to change, a couple of key elements are required. First, you've got to have relevant content. The individual items themselves need to be meaningful to the individual getting the feedback. If you're asking them about behaviors they don't really care about or aren't relevant to their context, it's not going to be very useful for change. Now, once they get the data, they also need to believe in it, right? So if you get feedback on something that that's relevant for you, but you don't believe that the data is honest, it's not collected or presented well, the individuals are the wrong individuals, again, not going to motivate change. Now, the third component is around accountability. Knowing that you need to change, believing the data is correct, isn't necessarily enough to get an individual to change. You need also to be accountable at some level for creating that change. And when you put these pieces together, you've got a chance at getting an individual to really change their behavior to be more effective in their current context. Of course, it's important that we're looking at the concept of acceptance, right? If you got all these pieces in there, but you don't have someone accepting that they need to change, it's going to be quite difficult. So the point of all of these is to get someone to that level where they say, "Oh, I get it. Yes, I do need to change, and I'm willing to invest in doing so." So we have a model for thinking about what that kind of looks like and how it plays out in a typical 360 process. And so one way to think about it is the first step is really around awareness, right? So the person needs to be aware that there's a need for change, that there's a gap perhaps in what they're doing, or sometimes it's not even a gap. Sometimes it's you need to stop worrying about getting better at something because actually others see you as excelling in that area, and worrying about it may not be quite so helpful. So the first thing is to be aware of their own behavior. And then once they're aware of their behavior, being able to set some plans in place to change that behavior, and then of course actually implementing it. What we find, though, is that there are a couple key elements. So I talked before about acceptance. If you're aware of the issue, but you're not quite at acceptance, even with an action plan, you're not likely to change your behavior. So acceptance and accountability come into play in terms of moving and bridging the gap between awareness and the plan and the actual change. These are two key elements. So when you look at any 360 program or process, you need to be thinking, is this process set up in such a way that leaders are going to accept the need for change? And are they actually going to be held accountable enough that they will change? And if when you look at your process, you don't see elements that are driving that, you may really that may be a great place to start focusing. One of the most common places and most effective levers for doing that, kind of filling these gaps, involves getting an individual to sit with somebody around their feedback, ideally a neutral individual, often from outside the organization, who can say, "Hey, this is what I see in the data, what do you see?" and hold them accountable for that. So what we often see in 360 processes is some coaching support. This doesn't need to be a 6-month in-depth analysis, but it could be even just an hour and a half with a coach that can help them get through the awareness into acceptance. That'll help them make the right action plan. Sometimes we see leaders will look at their feedback report and choose something that may not really line up with the report, or maybe overlooking some critical component. So getting them to accept sort of the right things and do some action planning around it. But also a coach can provide some level of accountability, especially if there are follow-up sessions. If not, there might be a handoff to where, say, the person's manager is holding them accountable, not necessarily for the data in the report, but for the specific plan they had to create change based on what was in the report. Now, don't just take my word for it. We also take quite a bit of time and effort around trying to understand what 360 feedback looks like in practice. And we've, as I mentioned, worked with many companies all around the globe implementing 360 processes. But we also look out at the marketplace to say, well, what is it that other companies are typically doing, which often provides a really useful and relevant data point for designing your own program. So we're now, I think, in our 5th edition of our benchmark study, where we look at current practices. And what I'd like to do is to go through a couple of key elements from the study where we have found the different components show up, and how you might think about these components that are driving change and what other companies are typically doing. So one of the first ones, I talked before about relevant content. So there's always this question, of course, of, where does the content come from? Is it off the shelf? Is it custom? Who built it? Was it a consultant from the outside? Was it internal? That sort of thing. So often very important for our clients to recognize, what does that typically look like? So what we found in our studies, and we've done these, as I mentioned, over many years, is that really off the shelf is not a zero item, but it's not as popular or widely used as a more customized tools. Now, when you get into the customized tools, often there's almost always going to be some sort of internal committee or internal input into that. But frequently you're using some sort of a consultant, either internal or external, to guide some of that development. And so off the shelf we see as being certainly in use, but much less so than a real tailored survey. And I think a lot of that has to do with that desire to create content that's highly relevant for the leaders in your organization. Those behaviors can highlight the behaviors that your senior leadership or your strategic plan are driving your organization towards. So it can be this customization can be a great way to get people focused on those critical behaviors and to message down through the organization what's expected of leaders from a behavioral level that lines up with that strategy. Now, we talked before also about accountability. So who receives a copy of the report? One of the key elements of accountability. What we're seeing in general are trends where the participant clearly is getting a report, but increasingly we're seeing HR, we're seeing the direct reports manager, all getting copies of these reports. In our recent study, we even differentiated between programs that were really mostly developmentally focused and those that were performance management focused. And we found that there were some pretty significant differences. Clearly in performance management, you're going to expect HR and perhaps the person's direct manager to receive the report. But even in the development-focused programs, pretty high percentages and increasing over the years, percentages of folks who are sharing the report beyond just the participant. So one of the things that we're seeing out there more frequently is a desire to leverage the results and leverage the data beyond just sort of self-directed development. Now, another component around accountability is, what do you do with the development after the report's been delivered? So what kind of support are you giving? So this could be everything from none, which obviously is quite minimal across the years, all the way up to, as I mentioned, kind of a one-on-one feedback debriefing. And while this has sort of been declining slightly, down, say, 7% in the last 14 years, it's still a pretty high percent and the most common way that people are trying to build in some accountability around development, that they're actually meeting with a feedback coach and or their manager to really have some accountability and teeth in the notion that they're doing something with the data, not just kind of looking at it. So again, when we look at these key design elements for change, I want to sort of shift the focus a little bit. What we've been talking about is individual level change. What does it take for an individual to change their behavior? The fourth component that we added into our model expands that individual behavior to say, well, let's take a look at systematic or organization-wide impact, and to realize that if you do all of these things with a whole bunch of individual leaders, sort of get census participation across the organization, you can have a huge impact, as I mentioned before, for example, on driving specific leadership behaviors across the organization. So instead of focusing on one manager who you want to change, you can actually focus on a huge group of managers within a system and get them all focused on a set of behaviors that is going to help the organization move in the direction it needs to move. So adding in this census participation really levels up the game, and this is one of the key components when we start thinking about what strategic 360 feedback is. The organizations are increasingly becoming thoughtful and strategic about how they use 360 as a lever to drive change down through their organization, whether they're trying to become more collaborative, more innovative, faster decision making, whatever it is. When they can break those behaviors down and then drive them across the system, you can make a huge difference in what you're seeing in leadership behavior, and have a large and significant effect on the results of the organization. So when we think about strategic 360 feedback, what is that? How would you differentiate a strategic 360 feedback process from a less strategic 360 feedback process? Well, Dave Bracken in a book I co-edited here has a great chapter on this, and he really breaks it down into a couple of basic components. So the first thing you want to think about in looking at how strategic is your program is that content derived from the organization's strategy and values? Is it unique to the organization? So again, we see some of this in the way that organizations typically use custom 360s. But I think the more strategic programs are the ones that are using this kind of content linked to strategy very intentionally, using it as a communication device. As I talked about before around census participation, the idea that 360 is not sort of this optional thing that some people do and some people don't, but rather we're using this in sections of the organization. It might be the whole organization. It could be a particular department. It could be a particular level. But there's intention and design around including a particular group of individuals. Another key component is that the results are reliable and valid. You can use them for decision making about organizations. This could be something as simple as, what should our training be for our leadership group for this next year? It could be something more sophisticated as, do we have the kind of talent and skill set we need to pursue the strategy that we have in mind? Or are we really needing to maybe level people up before we pursue that strategy? Variety of different levels of sophistication that you can use when you're trying to drive change across an organization. But again, if you're doing that with non-quantified or poorly written items with bad sort of psychometrics, that can be very problematic. You may be dealing with some sort of muddy data that are going to drive decisions that aren't necessarily the best because the data aren't accurate. The last is, again, actually using the data, integrating them into important and valuable talent management development processes. So this could include succession planning. This could include participation in high potential programs. Again, this could include what are your training programs going to be for a leadership swath across the organization, things along these lines. But the idea being that you don't just let those results sit with an individual and hope that they do something with them. Instead, you aggregate them up, use them across the system. So this is what we're really thinking about when we're thinking about strategic 360 feedback and the next level that you can take it to. As we've been thinking about this at 3D Group, one of the things that we've been seeing is, we work with organizations of all shapes and sizes, and we've started to kind of look at what are the different patterns of usage and purpose. And in fact, we've actually kind of expanded this beyond a little bit to see 5 different kinds of strategic use. So when we look at the organizations out there and through our benchmarking studies and our own work, what we find is, for example, that just about every organization has some buyer-driven 360 processes being used. So, individual leaders, maybe a particular HR manager, etc., are just going out and grabbing, sort of an off-the-shelf or ad hoc 360 and doing it for their own individual reasons. It's driven by the buyer. There's no real work through HR necessarily, and it's very idiosyncratic in the way it's being done. Virtually every organization has some of this being done in their organization somewhere. The next level up is much more sophisticated, much more systematic. It's a human resources driven process where there's some guardrails put in by human resources around what the 360 process will be. Now, it may be still that there's some ad hoc usage that people can use it whenever they want, but there are guardrails, there is a consistent process, and there's some attention to some of these issues around the way the 360 is used and how people are getting them, what the reports look like, that sort of thing. This is an important first level, I think, from starting to become strategic and drive 360 through the organization. The challenge with this is that it does tend still to be very sort of user-driven from a use standpoint. So it's a little bit less intentional and systematic. There is some consistency here, and you're getting a lot of kind of risk management by leveling this up, but it's not as strategic as it could be. A more strategic usage would be what we call program-driven usage. So these are programs like, say, a high potential program or a leadership program for a particular level, where you're incorporating a 360 that fits with that particular program and is one critical element. One of the more common strategic uses we're starting to see is custom 360s that are linked to the curriculum of a particular leader program. So you say, well, this is what we're going to be doing. Our needs analysis tells us that we need to teach our leaders all of these things. Let's build a 360 that helps give people individual feedback before they even start the program, so they can come to the program with some idea of where they might want to emphasize and focus. So again, a pretty strategic use focused on a particular set of individuals. The next level up we refer to as purpose-driven, and this is the idea that across an entire system, say a sales department, you can implement a 360 for all the leadership within that group to understand where they're at, what they're doing, and how you might work with them either on leveling up their skills or, again, as I mentioned, for a particular strategy that you're trying to implement. There could be other purposes here where you're using a 360 to just understand a particular group of individuals, and still you're going to be giving them the feedback and doing the individual level feedback so that at an individual level they're developing and growing. But what we see is clients trying to insert a system-wide 360 that's got a particular purpose. It could even be something where you're trying to decide, do we level people up from this particular group? What do we need them to do moving forward to grow as leaders as a group, not just as individuals? And then the last and most strategic use is what we refer to as business-driven. And these are systems where it's really fully system-wide. All leaders are getting feedback. They're doing this on a regular basis, usually annual, could be every other year, something along those lines. So they're still going through the rigor of taking a hard look at their leadership, on the behaviors that the organization values, but they're doing it as a regular course of doing business and being a leader in the organization. They use this as a way to continue learning about their effectiveness as leaders, and across the organization they realize this is a way that I must be looking at feedback from my colleagues to continually learn as a leader. Other examples of this are use of 360s for performance management, but again, the idea that 360s are integrated into just the regular business of the organization. So lots of different levels of strategic use. I would say that this last one is quite a bit more rare than the others. Clearly, the most common usages are really the buyer-driven, almost universal. Virtually every organization is doing that. Probably the next most is going to be human resources and program-driven. Many organizations are doing that. And then increasingly, the last two levels are being used more and more. And what we're seeing is with these last two levels, like I said, this increased usage, but there's also a community of organizations out there trying to learn how best to do this. So we've actually tried to cultivate that kind of learning community a bit, and have actually formed a forum to work through some of these issues, share best practices, share current practices, struggles, etc. And so we've formed the Strategic 360 Forum. It's been a great opportunity over the last several years to work at some of these host organizations with groups of other companies that are all coming together to discuss what they are doing to be more strategic in the way they use and lever 360 to link to talent strategies. So a number of different organizations around the country. If you're interested, I recommend you reach out to us. Again, a peer-to-peer learning environment. This is certainly not a top-down lecture, but rather organizations sitting around the table, sharing what they're doing, sharing what their struggles are, asking each other for help around how to be more strategic in the way they do their 360 process. So that's a little bit about how 360s can be more strategic and be used to drive change at the individual and group level. A little bit of a shameless plug here for 3D Group. If you're interested in developing a 360 feedback program or have questions about best practices, would love to talk to you. Appreciate you taking the time. Hope this video was useful, and please do check out the next installment, section 2, where I'm going to actually give a case study on an example of how we've done this in the past.